Hello class, I'm here in UBC Studios. Today is Monday, March 2nd. I'm recording this video to be played Wednesday and Friday this week in EDST 403, Education, Knowledge, and Curriculum. Before I start reading, I would first just like to very generously thank Dr. Basibo Pini, who is subbing for me. As I think I mentioned last week, she's doing this really as a form of personal, pedagogical, professional collegiality. In other words, out of the kindness of her heart, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that. To be honest, I think actually there's something about her generosity that is probably the main concern that I want to try to dig into in this short paper I'm going to read. I'm just going to get into the paper. This is a paper that I will send you via email so that you can have a look at my assignment if you want to. You don't have to. We agree that there'd be no reading outside of the class, so the agreement is still intact. However, if you want to take a look at my assignment and see how I did and perhaps let me know what your critiques or comments are, you're welcome to do that as well. But it's absolutely not required, not compulsory at all. This reading in class will be all you're required to listen to or to do. I have a pretty straightforward title, a reflection on Paulo Freire's Pedagogia do Oprimido, Pedagogy of the Oppressed in English. The subtitle is a makeup assignment on the banking concept of education. I wrote it in the form of a letter, as you'll see. So it's dated March 2nd, 2020. Dear teacher candidates, I'm going to write this reflection as a letter in the same literary style of the course syllabus. You do not have to read it in keeping with the trade this class is built on. I will read it aloud as I ordinarily read from my primer and share it via video. This is probably all very obvious to you. My initial impulse to write this was perhaps a bit of a gimmick. That is, to write this short paper to ensure that I was keeping my side of our trade. But now, and truly kind of as I started to write it and stopped thinking of it kind of in this perhaps gimmicky way, I'm more seriously motivated to try and share some of my thoughts about one of my favorite books. So at the beginning I thought I would do a 500-word assignment to the rubric that I specified in the syllabus. And then as I started writing it, I realized that obviously the way I approach this text, given that I've read it many, many, many times, in a few different languages and understand it from my work as a scholar, that I didn't want to be gimmicky, and I wanted to in some sense share not too much, but maybe a bit more than I would require an ordinary makeup paper to share. It's not that much longer, but it is probably about 1,500 words from here on out. So I'll just read. Pedagogia do Oprimido was written by Paulo Freire while he was living in exile in Chile in the year 1968. He was originally born and raised and educated in Brazil, and his exile from his home had a lot to do with the success of his educational initiatives that promoted adult literacy in Brazilian favelas. The favela is a word that we might use similar to slum in English or ejido in Spanish. Because of his work doing adult education, promoting literacy amongst the poor, Freire's work is revered in adult education, literacy education, and also in social justice education. I think he deserves all of this reverence. But I'm not so sure that many of his fans understand the social and political and philosophical context that led him to do that work. You see, in Brazil at the time, the condition for voting was literacy. If you could not read, you could not vote. This literacy requirement effectively blocked the poor from voting and kept the ruling class in power, disenfranchising a massive population of poor Brazilians, including many black Afro-Brazilians. Freire took an educational approach to this issue of voter disenfranchisement by teaching the poor how to read and then helping them make it out to vote. Freire was not exiled for being an adult educator or a literacy promoter or for loving the poor. He was exiled because all of those things combined into a powerful formula to challenge the political status quo in Brazil. Not just the status quo in the sense of the powerful, but even you could say the very present in the sense of time. He was in some sense offering a future to a country that was in many ways deeply stuck in a sort of reoccurring present. The reason I share this with you is because even those who agree with Freire's politics sometimes miss his reasons for doing what he did. And when they try to promote his approach to education, they can sometimes end up missing the real heart of the matter. For Freire, the point was not simply to give the poor a chance at participating in Brazilian elections. It was about giving the disenfranchised of his country the chance to stand and be counted as equals, as human beings, as persons with dignity. Freire was not primarily trying to increase literacy rates in Brazil, even though they did rise. Freire was not simply trying to win elections and create social movements, even though this did happen, and as a result, he was exiled from his own country. At the heart of all these things, Freire was more deeply trying to use education to practice a kind of freedom that not only set the captives free on the outside, but also set them free on the inside, giving them back what they always had to begin with, their dignity as persons, expressed not only through radical politics, but also through radical love. For Freire, and we see this mostly in chapter 4 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one cannot fight for the oppressed without communion with them, which entails bonds of loving solidarity. Freire was not simply fighting illiteracy and anti-democratic politics. He was more radically fighting unloving and even violent depersonalization and objectification. This is the fight. Luta is the word in Portuguese that Freire dedicates himself to in his book Pedagogia do Oprimido. And that word luta, or fight in Portuguese, is used in a very particular way in the dedication to the book that comes at the very beginning, which sadly in English has been kind of translated a bit. It's been reduced from like 7 lines to just 2. Anyhow, you might wonder why I'm referring to the Portuguese original version of the book that you know in English as Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The simple reason is that the translation carries some of the misunderstandings I mentioned above and also loses a lot of Freire's most powerful motivations behind his work. For example, the final 7 paragraphs of Pedagogia do Oprimido are lost in the translation to English. And I mean this literally, it's missing the 7 last paragraphs. The last sentence of those lost 7 paragraphs disclose Freire's purpose behind his very famous book. He says, in Portuguese, that he wrote the book to imagine a world where it is less difficult to love. Menos difícil amar. This loving purpose helps us understand why he proposed a pedagogy for the oppressed, and also what that pedagogy is ultimately for, what its moral aim is directed at, which is love. These issues of translation and contextual misunderstanding are one reason I do much of my educational work as a scholar and a philosopher, working in what you might call the educational foundations, reading and interpreting some of these particular texts. There is perhaps no book in the field of education that is read more globally than this book by Freire. In teacher education, it is common to assign chapter 2 from this book, where Freire critiques the banking concept of education and promotes instead a problem-posing pedagogy in its place. For most English readers, this chapter supports an approach to teaching where information and knowledge is not inserted, banked, deposited, or archived into students. Now, this is not the wrong reading of the chapter by any means, but it is premature to assume to know what is motivating Freire in his critique of the banking concept of education. At bottom, Freire writes, quote, "The great archives are persons in this mistaken banking concept of education. Archived because outside of the yearning, outside of praxis, persons cannot be." Freire continues to clarify the real danger of the banking concept of education when he writes further, quoting him again, quote, "The question is in thinking what is authentically dangerous about the banking concept. The strange humanism of this banking concept is reducible to the attempt to make persons into their opposite, an automaton, which is the negation of their ontological vocation to be more." End quote. In these passages from Pedagogia do Oprimido, chapter 2, that I've translated from Portuguese into English for you, we can see that Freire's metaphor of the bank extends much further than how to teach content or convey information or pass along knowledge or really any concern with mere learning. Education isn't a telephone game for Freire, or a game of telephone, where you're just passing along stuff. Freire's critique is ultimately about the way that the banking concept of education turns the person into an automaton, a non-person, into a datum, into an object that can be stored, archived, deposited, and banked. So the thing that the banking concept of education is banking is not, in its most radical form, knowledge or information or words or whatever, curriculum. It's ultimately about the person who's banked and about the person who is objectified into something that can be stored and put away and controlled and managed and so on. This is the real danger that Freire opposes, and his solution then is not reducible to a pedagogical method or instructional design. His solution to objectification and personalization is to attempt to imagine a world where it is less difficult to love. That's how we counter that radical danger of the banking concept of education for Freire. For Freire, good teaching and a wonderful curriculum are not a pedagogy of the oppressed on their own. Only love is. A great curriculum or lesson plan or set of teachings or classroom management strategies or a wonderful school or whatever can just as easily become a part of the banking concept of education as the terrible ones can. And in that sense, become these wonderfully terrible approaches to banking concepts of education. This may sound rather idealistic, this love stuff, to you. And if it does sound that way, that is because it is a vision of education that is built philosophically from ideals and principles. Freire was trained, educated, and worked as a philosopher. These ideals put into action were precisely what got Freire exiled from his own country. So I think ideals, even ideals that may seem as, not concrete, abstract as love, certainly were concrete enough to scare the status quo in his country at that time. And if you know anything about the politics of Brazil today, they continue to scare many people. Now, I think it is important to share why these reflections on Freire are personal to me. You might recall the rubric. I said, show that you read the text. Hopefully I've shown that. And then secondly, associate it to your own life or to your own experience. Maybe I haven't done that so well. So allow me to close with these three reasons that I find in Freire. First of all, Freire's ideas have deeply shaped my approach to teaching. Some people find it odd that I am fairly comfortable teaching with the traditional methods of my discipline of philosophy when I seem to simultaneously accept Freire's argument against the banking concept of education. How can you lecture with no conscience and at the same time promote Freire's ideas, which of course he in many cases presented in lectures or in books or in other forms of long monologue? But people wonder this sometimes. The way I reconcile those two things is to focus on the real goal that Freire had in mind and try as best I am able to hold myself morally and pedagogically accountable to it. I think any range of approaches to teaching can be effective, depending on a number of conditions, both internal and external. But I do not think there is a range of values if those values depart from the moral ideal that education should respect and honor the person and never risk turning that subject into a mere object. Secondly, and perhaps more personally, I have seen my own life transformed and empowered by this morally informed approach to education. And my sense of what is most important in my life as an academic is precisely this moral purpose that drives behind it, that pushes it. In my future work, I hope to not only translate Freire more faithfully from Portuguese to English, as I've hopefully shown a little bit here. If anyone, by the way, speaks Portuguese and you'd like to see the original passages, I'm happy to share those with you. I also would like to translate him to those who may think that they already understand him, along with those who have yet to be introduced to his powerful ideas about education, knowledge, and curriculum. That work is the part of my life as a scholar and academic, and I feel blessed to be able to share a small bit of it with you in your journey to become teachers. Thirdly, and finally, Freire's insight into what is authentically dangerous about the banking concept of education shows us that, at least on his view, the way we conceptualize or think about education can truly have real and lasting educational and even, we might say, political effects. The effect of depersonalization, where the student person is banked or archived away, is not only a danger to the student. Teacher persons can feel just as depersonalized, just as deposited into a faceless bureaucracy where they too lack moral status as a person. Some teacher candidates tell me they feel that way in the TEO or at UBC or in my own classes even. I think that as teachers, we need to be doubly aware of this danger of the banking concept of education, both for our students and also for ourselves. Hopefully, in the weeks that remain, we can spend more time testing our awareness of not only the dangers of depersonalization in education, but also the radical proposition that Freire makes to imagine a world where it is less difficult to love. Wishing you all a wonderful week from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. Your teacher, Sam. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. I'll see you in just a little over a week from today, and in a week's time from whenever you're watching this. Goodbye.